The morning sun filtered through the branches of a row of elms lining the street outside First Horizon Bank in Des Moines, Iowa. William Harris parked his car a block away and adjusted the lapels of his blazer. He glanced at his reflection in the car window. The years etched into his face told a story of hard work and perseverance. Today wasn't just about depositing a check. It was about progress. Another milestone in the journey he had worked tirelessly to build. Inside the bank, Margaret Harper stood behind the frosted glass door of her office, her well-manicured hands shuffling papers. As the branch manager, she carried herself with an air of authority. Her platinum blonde hair was tied in a precise bun, and she prided herself on running the branch with efficiency and, in her words, an eye for detail. But behind her polite smile lay an instinct to judge, a habit sharpened over years in her position. The bank was unusually quiet for a Friday morning, save for the low hum of conversations and the faint clink of coins being counted. Jessica, a wee-eyed young teller with a bright smile and an attentive demeanor, was assisting a customer when William walked in. His presence immediately drew a few curious glances. Not because of anything dramatic, but the subtle kind of scrutiny people reserved for strangers who didn't quite fit their assumptions. William approached Jessica's counter and placed a neatly folded check on the marble surface. "Good morning," he greeted warmly. "I'd like to deposit this." Jessica unfolded the check, and her eyes widened slightly. It was a sizable sum, more than most customers deposited in a year. She quickly masked her surprise with professionalism of, "Course, sir. One moment, please," she said, rising from her chair and walking briskly toward Margaret's office. As she approached, she noticed Margaret's brow furrow as she skimmed an email, her expression unreadable. "Miss Harper, there's a client with a large check. I thought you might want to review it." Margaret barely looked up. "How large are we talking?" Jessica handed over the check. Margaret's lips pursed as she read the amount, then glanced toward William, who stood patiently at the counter. Something about him unsettled her, though she couldn't or wouldn't say what. "I'll handle this," Margaret said curtly, stepping out of her office. Jessica hesitated, a small voice in her mind urging her to stay close, but Margaret's glance left no room for argument. Margaret approached William with an air of authority. "Sir, I'm Margaret Harper, the branch manager. May I ask where you acquired this check?" William raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "It's from one of my business accounts. Is there an issue?" "Not necessarily," Margaret replied, her tone clipped. "But checks of this size require additional verification, standard procedure, of course." William crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "Standard procedure? I've been banking here for years. I've never encountered this before." Margaret's lips curled into a tight smile. "It's just a precaution, Mr. Harris. If you could provide some additional documentation to verify the source of these funds, we can proceed." Jessica, watching the exchange from behind her station, felt her stomach sink. Something about Margaret's tone felt unnecessarily sharp, almost as if she was looking for a reason to doubt the man standing before her. "Everything you need is on the check," William replied evenly, gesturing toward it. "If there's something specific you need, I'm happy to help. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you could deposit it." Margaret's smile faded, replaced by a look of practiced skepticism. "I'll need to review this further. Please wait here." She turned and walked back to her office, leaving William standing at the counter. His jaw tightened as he resisted the urge to say more. Around him, the quiet murmur of the bank seemed louder now, each glance from the staff and other clients feeling like a spotlight. Jessica stepped closer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harris," she said softly. "I'll try to—" "It's fine," William interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'll wait." In her office, Margaret picked up the phone, dialing a number to begin her so-called verification process. She glanced at the check again, her suspicions gnawing at her. Something about this man, his confidence, his composure, challenged her assumptions in a way she wasn't prepared to admit. Back in the lobby, William's eyes landed on a framed photo of the bank's leadership team near the entrance. His expression remained calm, but frustration simmered beneath the surface. He had dealt with moments like these before, where his success and legitimacy were questioned, not because of his actions, but because of perceptions. Margaret lingered in her office as the minutes dragged on and the tension in the air thickened. William checked his watch, his patience wearing thin. The bank lobby, though polished and inviting, now felt like a stage, with him as the unwilling center of attention. He noticed lingering glances from customers, some mildly curious, others poorly concealing their judgment. He wasn't one to make a scene, but the growing frustration tugged at the edges of his composed demeanor. Behind the counter, Jessica fidgeted, her gaze darting between William and Margaret's office. She had seen this play out before, not with William, but with other clients who didn't quite fit Margaret's idea of a serious customer. It was one of the reasons she had considered leaving her job more than once. But today felt different. Watching William stand there, calm yet visibly uncomfortable, she felt a pang of guilt for not stepping in more forcefully. In her office, Margaret was on the phone with someone from the verification department, her voice low but firm. "Yes, I need a thorough check on this account," she said, glancing at the check again as if its authenticity might change under closer scrutiny. "I'm not convinced it's legitimate." The response on the other end seemed to irritate her. "No, I don't care how long he's been a client here. This amount is unusual. I want a full review." She hung up, took a deep breath and walked back into the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. William met her gaze as she approached, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Mr. Harris," Margaret began, her tone clipped. "I'm still waiting on some confirmations. Until then, I can't process this check." William's brow furrowed slightly. "And how long is that going to take?" "It depends." She crossed her arms. "These things take time." "Time," William repeated, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've provided everything you need. My account is in good standing. This isn't a request. It's a routine transaction. What exactly is the issue here?" Margaret hesitated for a brief moment, but her expression quickly hardened. "The issue, Mr. Harris, is that I have to ensure due diligence. Large sums like this aren't typical, and I need to verify that everything checks out." William's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping. "Not typical for who exactly?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Jessica stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Miss Harper," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen Mr. Harris's account before. He's conducted transactions like this without any issues." Margaret shot her a glare cold enough to freeze water. "Jessica, this doesn't concern—" "You go back to your station." Jessica hesitated but didn't back down. "It does concern me. Mr. Harris is a valued client, and this situation doesn't feel right." "Enough!" Margaret snapped, her voice rising. A few heads in the lobby turned toward the commotion. "I will handle this. Get back to your work." William exhaled sharply, his patience running thin. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice now carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I'd like to speak with someone higher up. Clearly you're not willing to do your job." Margaret's face reddened, but before she could respond, the sound of the main doors opening drew everyone's attention. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in a sleek navy suit, strode into the lobby with an air of authority that commanded respect. Her auburn hair framed a face marked by years of experience and quiet determination. It was Caitlin Monroe, the regional director. She paused for a moment, surveying the scene. Margaret's flushed face, William's composed but frustrated stance, and Jessica's nervous posture. "What's going on here?" Caitlin asked, her voice calm but firm as she approached. Margaret straightened, her demeanor shifting to forced professionalism. "Miss Monroe, I wasn't expecting you. We're just reviewing a large transaction." Caitlin's gaze flicked to William, her expression softening. "Is there a problem with the transaction?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but William spoke first. "Apparently there is. Despite providing all necessary documentation, Miss Harper seems to believe my funds need special scrutiny." Caitlin's eyes narrowed slightly as she turned back to Margaret. "Special scrutiny? And why would that be?" "It's a routine precaution," Margaret replied quickly, her voice tight. "I'm just ensuring everything is in order." Caitlin glanced at the check on Margaret's desk, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she turned back to William. "Mr. Harris," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Caitlin Monroe, the regional director. I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. Let's get this resolved immediately." William shook her hand, his grip firm but polite. "Thank you, Miss Monroe. I appreciate that." Caitlin's next words were directed at Margaret, her tone now icier. "Margaret, bring that check to my office. We'll finish this conversation there." The tension in the room was palpable as Margaret hesitated before nodding stiffly and retreating with Caitlin. William watched them go, his expression unreadable but his resolve firm. Inside the privacy of her office, Caitlin closed the door and gestured for Margaret to sit. The regional director's calm demeanor had shifted into one of unmistakable authority. Margaret sat stiffly, clutching the check in her hands as Caitlin took a seat across from her. "Let me see that check," Caitlin said, extending her hand. Margaret hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing it over. Caitlin examined it closely, flipping it over to review the back. Her brow furrowed briefly, but it wasn't the check that concerned her. It was the situation that had led to this moment. "Margaret," Caitlin began, placing the check on the desk between them. "Do you realize whose account this belongs to?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I was just following protocol. The amount raised a red flag and I thought it best to verify." "Stop," Caitlin interrupted, her voice sharp. "This isn't about protocol, and you know it." She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "This account belongs to William Harris. Does that name mean anything to you?" Margaret's confusion deepened. "Should it?" Caitlin's expression hardened. "William Harris is the largest shareholder in this bank. He owns a controlling stake. In other words, he's your boss." Margaret's face drained of color. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And why didn't you know?" Caitlin pressed. "His name is on the leadership roster. His account history is spotless. And yet, you chose to treat him with suspicion. Why?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, her mind racing. You thought wrong," Caitlin snapped, cutting her off. "This wasn't about the check. This was about your assumptions. You looked at him and decided he didn't fit your idea of someone who could deposit this amount. Do you deny it?" Margaret's silence was deafening. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet Caitlin's eyes. Meanwhile, back in the lobby, William remained at the counter, his calm exterior concealing the storm brewing within. Jessica approached cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harris," she said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "I just want to say, I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." William turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "It's not your fault, Jessica. You tried to help. That means something." Jessica looked down, her cheeks flushing with a mix of relief and embarrassment. "Thank you. I hate seeing people treated like this." Before William could respond, Caitlin and Margaret emerged from the office. Margaret's face was pale, her jaw tight as she avoided William's gaze. Caitlin, on the other hand, radiated the kind of calm that came from knowing she was about to set things right. "Mr. Harris," Caitlin said, approaching him with an apologetic smile. "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. Your transaction will be processed immediately, and I assure you this matter will be addressed." William inclined his head slightly. "I appreciate that, Miss Monroe." Caitlin gestured for Jessica to assist William with the transaction. Jessica stepped forward, her hands steady as she processed the check with practiced efficiency. The tension in the room seemed to lift slightly as the ordeal neared its conclusion. As the check cleared, Caitlin turned to Margaret. "Margaret, I need to speak with you in private. Now." Margaret's shoulders slumped as she followed Caitlin back to the office, knowing what was coming. Inside the office, Caitlin didn't waste time. "Your behavior today was unacceptable," she said bluntly. "Not only did you humiliate one of our most valued clients, but you also jeopardized the reputation of this entire branch." Margaret's lips trembled as she tried to form a response. "I didn't mean to." "Intentions don't matter," Caitlin interrupted. "What matters is the impact of your actions. Effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave. You'll have the option to resign with a letter of recommendation, or you can face an internal investigation. The choice is yours." Margaret's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Please, Caitlin." "This conversation is over," Caitlin said firmly, rising to her feet. "You'll receive the necessary paperwork by the end of the day." Margaret stood shakily and left the office, her face a mask of disbelief. Caitlin took a deep breath, gathering herself before returning to the lobby. Back in the lobby, William was finishing up his transaction with Jessica. The tension in the room had eased, but the weight of what had occurred still lingered. Jessica handed William his receipt, offering a small, sincere smile. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Harris," she said softly. William took the receipt and gave Jessica a slight nod. "Thank you, Jessica. Your integrity didn't go unnoticed." Caitlin approached them, her professional demeanor softened by a genuine air of remorse. "Mr. Harris," she began, "I've spoken with Miss Harper. She will no longer be managing this branch. What happened today was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring it never happens again." William studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that, Miss Monroe, but this isn't just about today. Incidents like this happen more often than they should, and addressing them takes more than firing one person." Caitlin nodded, his words striking a chord. "You're absolutely right. That's why I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can improve, not just at this branch but across all our locations. Your perspective would be invaluable." William crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "It starts with education. Staff need to understand the implicit biases they carry and how those biases affect their judgment. Implementing training programs focused on inclusion and cultural awareness would be a good start." "I agree," Caitlin said, pulling out a notebook to jot down his suggestions. "What else would you recommend?" William glanced around the lobby, his eyes settling on Jessica. "There also needs to be a system in place for employees to speak up when they see something wrong, without fear of retaliation." Jessica tried to do the right thing, but she wasn't empowered to make a difference. Jessica blinked in surprise, her cheeks flushing at the recognition. Caitlin turned to her, a small smile softening her face. "That's an excellent point. Jessica, I'd like to thank you for your professionalism today. If you ever have concerns, my door is open." Jessica nodded shyly, her voice quiet. "Thank you, Miss Monroe," William continued, his voice firm. "And finally, there needs to be accountability at every level. If someone in power abuses their authority, there should be consequences, real ones." Caitlin closed her notebook, her expression resolute. "I couldn't agree more. I'll make it a priority to implement these changes. You have my word." William extended his hand, and Caitlin shook it firmly. "Thank you, Miss Monroe. I hope these changes create a better experience for everyone." As Caitlin stepped away to speak with the staff, William turned to Jessica once more. "You're going to do great things, Jessica. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Jessica smiled, her confidence bolstered by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Harris." William collected his belongings and made his way to the exit. The weight of the morning's events still lingered, but he felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that something good could come from it. Caitlin watched him leave, her thoughts swirling with determination. This incident had revealed cracks in the foundation, but it also presented an opportunity to rebuild something stronger, something better. The next morning, the boardroom at First Horizon Bank's headquarters in Kansas City buzzed with murmurs as the leadership team gathered. At the head of the table sat William Harris, his calm presence commanding attention. To his left, Caitlin Monroe prepared her notes, while a projector displayed the words "Inclusive Banking Initiative" on the screen behind them. William stood, his voice steady but firm. What happened yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a culture that allows bias to influence decisions even at the highest levels. This is unacceptable. The room fell silent as his words sank in. William continued, his gaze sweeping across the table. This bank serves a diverse community. If we don't reflect the values of that community, respect, fairness, and equality, we fail not just our clients, but ourselves. Caitlin took over, outlining the proposed changes discussed the previous day. We're implementing 3 immediate actions. First, mandatory inclusion and cultural awareness training for all staff, starting with management. Second, a clear and confidential reporting system for employees to flag concerns without fear of retaliation. Third, a comprehensive review of internal policies to eliminate bias in decision-making. The leadership team exchanged thoughtful glances, a few nodding in agreement. Caitlin continued, "These aren't just about compliance. They're about fostering a culture where everyone, clients and employees alike, feels valued and respected." William stepped back in. "This isn't a quick fix. It's a commitment to change, and it starts here with all of us." The room erupted in quiet applause, a rare display of unity among the typically reserved executives. Caitlin smiled, but the weight of responsibility lingered in her expression. The real work was just beginning. Later that afternoon, when William returned to the Des Moines branch, the atmosphere felt markedly different. Staff greeted him warmly, and even the clients seemed more at ease. Jessica spotted him immediately and approached, her nervous energy replaced with quiet confidence. "Mr. Harris," she said, "it's good to see you again." William smiled. "Jessica, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did yesterday. It took courage to speak up, and I want you to know it didn't go unnoticed." Jessica's cheeks reddened, but she held his gaze. "I just did what I thought was right." "That's exactly the kind of mindset this bank needs," William replied. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. "If you're ever interested in moving up in your career, give me a call. We need more people like you in leadership roles." Jessica stared at the card, her eyes widening. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I'll think about it." As William turned to leave, he paused near the leadership team photo hanging in the lobby. His name and face were there, prominently displayed among the other shareholders, a reminder of how far he had come and how much work still lay ahead. Stepping out into the crisp afternoon, William felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a check or a single incident. It was about building a system that treated everyone with dignity, a legacy that would outlast him.